I'm coming on camera in a second. Sorry, I had to move locations.
Okay, it should alert when it's ready.
Okay, it looks like it. So, okay, I'll go ahead and open the meeting. Good morning, everybody. Today is December 2nd, 2025. Welcome to the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board Partnerships and Capacity Committee meeting. I'd like to remind everyone that this is a virtual meeting that's being streamed live on the OWEB's YouTube channel and recorded. The meeting materials are in the board and committee section of the OWEB website. They're towards the bottom of the page, and viewers can click the relevant committee and have access to the current materials, as well as past recordings. And that's where this one will be posted. So we'll go ahead and do introductions here in a moment. We'll review the agenda and then we'll get started. So I'd like to have OWEB board members first introduce themselves. So let's go Woody and then Mark Labhart, please.
Woody Wolf, co-chair.
Good morning, Mark Labhart. I'm the ODF&W Commission rep on OWEB and a voting member, and I live in Sisters.
Thank you. And we'll go to Raya next. Welcome.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Raya Bushnell, and I am a public voting member of the board.
Great. We'll move on to staff. So we'll go Sarah, Eric, and Eric.
Hey, everybody. Sarah O'Brien, OWEB's executive director, and welcome, Raya, to your first committee meeting as a new board member.
Good morning, everybody. Eric Williams with OWEB. I'm the Restoration Grants Manager, and thanks all for being here today.
And good morning, everybody. Eric Hartstein, Senior Policy Coordinator at OWEB.
Good morning. Jillian and Nicole, please.
Good morning, everyone. Jillian McCarthy, OWEB Partnerships Coordinator. Good to see everyone this morning.
Hello, Nicole Bettinardi, OWEB's Executive Assistant and Board Liaison, and I'll be off mute most of the time because my cat over here is snoring very loudly.
Cute. We can't hear them yet. Okay, we'll move on to Neil and Chris, and then I'll introduce myself.
I'm Neil Schulman. I'm the Executive Director of the North Clackamas Watersheds Council. We're just kind of tracking this process in committee, and I've had a lot of conversations, obviously, with Sarah and Eric and other folks about it. And I'm very glad, obviously, that OWEB is going through this process.
Okay.
Good morning, Chris Knight. I'm the Executive Director at the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council. Also just listening in today and tracking the process. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I see Terry has joined us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Lindsay. My name is Terry Prieg-Rigsby, and I'm the Executive Director of the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils. Thank you.
Great. And my name is Lindsay McCleary. I am a OWEB board member and also co-chair of this committee, public at-large voting member, and I live in West Salem. So with that, today's agenda, the meeting is scheduled from 9 to 10:30. We just did welcome and introductions. We'll move through public comment, operating capacity, pre-rulemaking engagement. We'll have a status update on that. We'll get to preview the focused investment partnerships ecological priorities and discuss the biennium cap that the board will set, I believe, if not at the next board meeting, soon. And then we'll wrap up and have any future topics or good of the order items. So I know we didn't receive any written public comment. Is that still true, Nicole? Great. Okay. Anyone here joining us today interested in giving verbal public comment or testimony? Okay, not seeing anybody. I will turn it over then to Eric Williams to give us a status update on the operating capacity and rulemaking engagement.
All right. Thank you, Chair McCleary, members of the committee, and those attending and viewing at home. Again, welcome and thanks for being here. Our first agenda item is to follow through with some more detailed information on something that Sarah highlighted in her director's report at the October board meeting with regard to rulemaking. We've obviously been very busy with rulemaking in the last couple of years and will be in the years to come. We're currently working through water acquisition rules. We have land acquisition on the rulemaking schedule. And the next one that Sarah mentioned that we're likely to tackle and ask for the board to form a rulemaking advisory committee at some point in 2026 is on our capacity grant offerings. And I wanted to walk through some of the background for why we're ready to go into rulemaking for those grants. And then when I'm done with those overview points, Eric Hartstein's going to walk through a pre-rulemaking engagement process and schedule. We know we have a lot of communicating to do before we even start the rulemaking process, and that's our intent with this pre-rulemaking engagement. So in terms of why we're pursuing rulemaking at this time, we've offered capacity grants to both watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts for many, many years. We have those offerings for those two groups of organizations, but they're intended for the same purpose. And the purpose really is to develop restoration and acquisition projects. We would like to establish a common set of rules that governs both of those programs. Rules, as you're familiar with, typically cover who's eligible for different grant offerings, what are the eligible activities, how are the applications going to be reviewed? In other words, what are the evaluation criteria for applications under those offerings? What funding conditions might apply, and things like match requirements. Currently, we have rules that only apply to the watershed council capacity grants. The district capacity grants don't have a specific set of rules. Of course, all of our grant offerings follow our overarching Division 5 rules, but we've recognized that we probably need to align the capacity grants so that both sets of organizations are following, hopefully, the same set of rules. The council capacity rules were last updated in 2014. And as you're probably familiar with, we try to at least review our sets of rules every 5 years to see if they need updating. Given that we're 11 years out from our last rulemaking effort on capacity, we're kind of overdue to look at those rules in some detail. And another point I wanted to stress here is around our constitutional requirements that are also expressed in statute, which very clearly specify what we can use our grant funds for. And it really is about implementing restoration and acquisition projects and funding the types of work that's needed to be able to implement those restoration and acquisition grants. And we've categorized those types of actions necessary for restoration as technical assistance, monitoring, and engagement. Given that those are the legal parameters for these grants, probably a more accurate title for these offerings would be project development grants, since that's what the constitutional directive for the funds is. Another thing to note here is that under our current structure, given that these funds are intended to position councils and districts to be able to implement project grants, we've not allowed the charging of indirect costs like we do in all of our other grant programs. That's something that may or may not need to be addressed in the rules, but it's something we would like to begin implementing at some point with our capacity grants, just out of having a rational and fair process for awarding grants and following our typical grant making procedures. This would streamline things a bit so that councils and districts could operate those grants in the same way that they would operate any other OWEB grant. In terms of the engagement that we'd like to do, the pre-rulemaking engagement, we are working already with the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts and the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils to think about structuring dialogue with our partners on this topic. We have tentatively planned a webinar with OACD and the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils for early February to kick this off. We would also like to have regional listening sessions in each of our 6 OWEB regions. And in addition to that, offer a virtual session or more than one virtual session, as well as a survey vehicle for those that choose not to attend listening sessions, but may still want to provide input into this process. We expect to do that engagement, as I said, beginning in February and carrying through into the spring. And Eric's going to provide more details about that in a few minutes here. Now, of course, once we get to rulemaking, the purpose of the Rules Advisory Committee is to provide an opportunity for public input and engagement on proposed rule changes. RAC membership consists of those who are impacted by the rules, and so we will have representatives from watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts, and the process, as usual, will be facilitated by OWEB staff. Once we go through that rulemaking process, there's a public comment period and a process for board deliberation and adoption of those rules. And so to kick that all off, we likely will be requesting the OWEB board to form the Rules Advisory Committee, either at the April meeting, but probably more likely the July meeting of 2026. And then that rulemaking process will probably take almost a year to get to final rule adoption by the board. And so what that means is any revised rules, any new rules that apply to capacity grants or project development grants wouldn't take effect until the 2029-2031 biennium. And yes, we're already talking about the 2030s here. So it's closer than we all think it is, I think. Just because of the structure of our capacity grants operating on a biennial basis, we're currently, of course, in the 25-27 biennium and have capacity grants that are open now with districts and councils. The next biennium, 27-29, we'll be starting that process next year for those. And so these rules won't be done in time to impact the 27-29 biennium. So let me stop there and see if there's any questions on background and why we're here. And then I'll turn it over to Eric to talk about the pre-engagement schedule.
Thank you, Eric. And I'd just like to note that Liz Agpawa joined. So Liz, good morning. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, Liz Agpawa, liaison from the Board of Forestry and voting board member.
Good morning. Thanks, Eric, for that synopsis. Are there questions or comments for Eric Williams? Not seeing anyone. I did have a question, and I think you clarified it, but I want to go back to the indirect rate. And so if I understand it right, currently indirect rate has not been an allowable expense under the operating capacity, and that's not necessarily in rule, it's more in process, but we're looking at maybe allowing indirect charges going forward after this rulemaking process.
We could conceivably do it before rulemaking. It isn't something that's typically covered in the rules for a particular offering. So as a matter of process, if we think this is a good way to go, it's something we could consider for the 27-29 capacity grants.
Thank you. Mark Labhart.
I can't find my raised hand. Mainly a comment. So Eric and Sarah, I'd just like to highlight the process. I think it's really good what you're doing. The webinar, the feedback involving stakeholders that are directly impacted, involving the public, the whole process. Go slow to go fast. I think that's kudos to staff for putting that together so we don't rush through this. It's important to watershed councils and districts and so on that that they be involved in this process, and excuse me, and that we make sure that we end up with some rules that are strongly supported. Thanks.
Any other comments or questions? Woody.
Yeah, I was just wondering if Eric might give some examples of some indirect costs and a thought process of how much, maybe of a percentage increase that might put on our spending, possibly.
Yeah, thanks, Woody. So our indirect costs typically cover things like building rent and office supplies and equipment that aren't charged to a particular project grant. And so currently they're itemizing those in their capacity grants. The allowable de minimis indirect rate is 15%. And so what this would mean is that for a capacity grant, when they bill us for reimbursement of direct project development expenses like staff time, holding landowner meetings, for example, they would attach a 15% indirect charge on that to cover those expenses that aren't chargeable for direct costs. And so right now they're itemizing all of that stuff in a capacity grant, and given the way that grant making in general works, given the way that federal grants work, that's not really a typical way of handling reimbursement for those kinds of expenses. And I think from our perspective, it kind of frees up the grantees to not have to worry about itemizing all those expenses as direct costs, and they can focus their reimbursement requests on things like the staff time spent building projects for their direct billings. Another item I should mention that I left out is in the grants to the soil and water conservation districts, the Oregon Department of Agriculture plays a significant role in getting those grants off the ground and working with districts to ensure focus on their priority water quality work. And we have been engaging with ODA staff over the past year on this as well. So you can call that sort of pre-rulemaking engagement that we've been doing. And I wanted to express appreciation for the collaborative approach that all of the ODA staff have long had with OWEB in working on these grants and continue to have as we're working through this engagement process.
Thank you. It looks like we might be ready to move to Eric Hartstein.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. And just to maybe flesh out a little bit more on that pre-engagement piece. So first, big thanks to Terry and her counterpart, Andrea Kreiner at Oregon Association of Conservation Districts, who agreed to have us present through a webinar in early February, February 4th, and we will have both OWEB and ODA staff there to present the webinar. And that will really kind of kick off the engagement process. And the way we envision this is we'll have a mix of in-person listening sessions and virtual listening sessions. We know that it's important to be in communities when we're doing things like opening up the capacity grant rules and bringing in the district capacity into that rule set. So we'll be doing a bit of a roadshow probably later in February into March, along with having virtual listening sessions, knowing that for a variety of reasons, people may not be able to attend an in-person listening session. And at the same time, we're going to be developing a survey that will go out. And like we learned some pretty good lessons in doing the FIP ecological priorities. When we had our listening sessions, we had a survey and we kind of synced the questions with the survey to the same questions that we were asking during the listening sessions. So we had a really good response for both the survey and the listening sessions, and we're able to compare kind of apples to apples there. So if folks are not able to attend any of the listening sessions, they will be able to fill in a survey or do both. We want to make sure we're covering all the basics, as well as if folks are just interested in calling OWEB or ODA staff and having kind of that one-on-one discussion. So we expect to kind of wrap up those listening sessions in the spring, and hopefully if there's space and Terry and Andrea will have us, we can have a presentation at the Connect Plus conference in April seeing a thumbs up from Terry. So that will then kind of wrap up the engagement process before we go to the board to ask to initiate formal rulemaking, which will then kick off another whole formal engagement process that we'll do with all of our rulemaking. So I'll stop, see if there's any questions.
Great, thanks for that. A couple comments in the chat, which I don't think folks online can see. So I'll just say, Neil has noted that on February 4th, there is a River Restoration Northwest conference happening. So a lot of watershed councils may be at that event. Seeing some head nods, so folks are aware of that. And then Terry had a question about indirect costs. Do you want me to read that, Terry, or do you want to chime in?
Yeah, sorry, this is like backtracking a little bit to what Eric Williams was talking about. But I was just curious because Woody asked, would it increase the total amount of cost for the grants? And my understanding with indirect costs is that they are usually a percentage of what's spent, but it's still folded into the total amount of the grants. So the amount that OWEB is distributing would not necessarily increase. It would just be a different way that grantees are reporting their costs. Is that correct?
That's correct, Terry.
Okay.
And in terms of the overall amount, that's set, of course, in the spending plan that the board adopts each biennium. And so there will be discussions on spending plan amounts in every biennium. But of course, as these rules take effect in 2931, there will be a conversation at the board level and a decision about how much of the spending plan to allocate to the capacity or project development grants.
Okay. And since I'm on now, our webinar that is on February 4th is at 1 o'clock and 1 to 2:30. So Neil, hopefully some folks may be able to step away from the conference for a little bit and log in, and there will be it will be all of our webinars are recorded, and there will be additional opportunities for input all throughout the spring.
Go ahead, Neil.
And OWEB staff is usually has a pretty robust presence at River Restoration Northwest, and I think there also might even be opportunities just to pull a group together there, be a little ad hoc. But the other question I had was really just a process question. I'm assuming that the final rules would need to go through DOJ, and I'm assuming that is a lengthy procedure of uncertain duration. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So thanks for that question, Neil. Yeah, all of our rules we do consult with our DOJ attorney, and it can be a lengthy process. Kind of just depends on the pending rule set. I think our experience is that they have a pretty quick turnaround time with our rules, so that's really never been I'd say a big time sink for us when we're doing rulemaking.
Sarah.
Lindsay, can I share a quick,
Yes,
I think it might be helpful in particular for Mark and Liz that serve on other state boards and commissions. I think Eric's and I are also keeping in mind here, there's a kind of framework that the Governor's Natural Resource Office has been developing sort of at the request of partners and stakeholders to increase the consistency in rulemaking practices and processes amongst our natural resource agencies, just recognizing that there are a heck of a lot of us and we do a lot of rulemaking. And so Mark and Liz may have seen that there's sort of a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and a set of guidance and best practices associated with each of those based on what the complexity and controversial nature of that. So Eric and I had a chance to sort of weigh in and help the governor's office with the development of that and provide some feedback and back and forth. So we feel pretty comfortable that it's pretty consistent with the approach that we had anyway, but this is one that we had flagged initially as like, well, we don't do a lot of tier 3 rulemaking. We don't do a lot of super controversial sort of more policy or regulatory, obviously oriented rulemaking, but this is one where we were like, yeah, this might kind of fall on the line between tier 2 and tier 3, or Hartstein can tell me if I've got my numbering off. I think I'm going in the right direction, but this is one that we were like, yeah, that might be one of the few things that we do that falls in that more complex category that really warrants, as Mark Labhart described, a much more robust level of partner engagement and a longer timeline associated with it. So I just wanted to make sure that we can orient to that and assure folks that are familiar with that framework that we're paying attention to it.
Thank you, Sarah.
Because I want a gold star from the governor's office at the end of this. Like I think that's probably the key take home there.
Fair. Okay, any other comments or questions about operating capacity and the process? Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead at this point and turn it over to Co-Chair Wolf.
Thank you, Lindsay. So it looks like it's time for preview FIP edgeological priorities and discussion FIP biennium cap.
Yeah, I'll kick things off on this one. So the staff are working on some minor revisions to the ecological priorities that were presented to the board in October. And those minor revisions are based on some of the board feedback that we heard. And we will be presenting those final drafts to the board in January for consideration and hopefully approval. We wanted to spend a little bit more time at this meeting on the biennial funding cap that was kind of previewed in October. Kind of as a reminder that there was a $4 million funding cap for the FIP program that was removed by the board when the rules were revised back in January, and that the new rules state that prior to a solicitation, the board will determine the cap on the biennial reward. So I'll pull up those slides that we had at the October board meeting. That's just as a way to kind of kick off the discussion here. And so this is the historic range of the FIP awards going back to 2015. So we've had 20 FIP partnerships with 3 biennia each, so totaling 60 awards. So you see that the range goes from at the top end, that 2 to 3 million. And then down to 4 million, there was about 13 awards. In the 3 to 4 million range, there was 10, and then there was 2 that have been under 1 million. Get to next. So this is just a little bit different way of showing that distribution. So starting back in the 2015, 2017 biennium, you'll note that there's one partnership was at $4 million per biennium. So each of these colors is a different FIP partnership. Most were kind of close to that $2 million per biennium. And then over time, that's increased, as you see, into the 23, 25, and certainly into the current biennium. And then what's on the docket for the cohort 4 FIPS in 27, 29, and their requests are all up close to that $4 million per biennium mark. And kind of a good reason for that, we think, is that we've had some inflation since 2015, and this just demonstrates that that $4 million back in 2016, when the first FIPS were awarded, would be about $5.4 million in 2025 dollars. So we wanted just to make sure that the committee had that information before having a discussion on the biennial cap. And yes, Lindsay, this will be something that the board will need to determine in January, as we will be going to a solicitation in early February after the ecological priorities are adopted for the full program. So stop and see if there's questions or if there's discussion.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you. So more of a process question, being involved in the prior grants committee, when the FIP applications would come in, that committee would really do a deep dive on all of those applications and then meet with the partnerships and kind of help in the process of the sort of the review of that. When the board sets the biennium cap, I would like to talk a little bit about that process, because when a FIP application comes in, they usually have a structured budget for 3 biennium for 6 years. So when they submit an application, I assume it's probably still going to be that 6-year kind of horizon. And we're just setting funds for that first kind of 2-year budget cycle for those projects. So, gosh, is there like, how do we reconcile that? Is there any concern over that, or am I splitting hairs?
Yeah, so I think, Lindsay, you're asking when the board determines that funding cap, then that really kind of will carry the throughout the next 3 biennia for an application that is submitted.
That's what I was asking. Yeah. So when we set this biennium cap, would that be the cap for potentially 6 years, not just 2 years?
For the applications that are coming in for that solicitation would be the cap for that 6 years. And then the board will determine a new cap, or obviously it could be the same cap for the next solicitation. I think the way we at least envisioned it, that there wouldn't be a huge discrepancy over a couple of years, that this would be something that could, kind of float with inflation a little bit. So you wouldn't have a huge increase or decrease from solicitation to solicitation.
Yeah, thank you. That's super helpful to kind of frame, what we would be discussing here and what the board would be approving is, kind of the lifetime of those FIPS that come in through this solicitation. Okay, thank you.
Okay, if somebody else has a question, I'm not on my screen able to see all the participants. So if anybody else has their hand up and I can't see them, please go ahead and ask. Okay, hearing nobody, do you have more, Eric, or is there somebody else in line to present on this topic?
I don't have any more to present. I'll look to Eric or Jillian to see if they have any thoughts. I mean, I think it would be good If the committee was comfortable to have even a recommendation coming out of this meeting for the full board on what that cap might be, you know, starting at that $4 million number, I think.
Well, okay, I have a question. So the slide that you showed represented a 35% inflationary cost, so devaluation of money, and we're getting more partnerships over time, which means we're spending more money. Where does the lottery dollars, what is our expected capacity to fund inflationary costs and more partnerships? And at what point do we have to, or do we have a limited amount of money that is going to start decreasing instead of what the trend looks like it's been increasing over the last decade?
I've got a couple of thoughts on that, Woody. And there's a couple of things at play here. One is, you know, the FIP program is conceived to achieve landscape scale change. And, you know, the cap kind of relates to what's a reasonable amount of funds to be able to accomplish those outcomes that the FIP program is designed to achieve. And that's really separate from the figure that ends up in the board's spending plan each biennium to fund new FIPs. Right. So those two things obviously relate to each other. And, you know, whatever is in the spending plan is going to be the limit of how many new FIPs we can award, regardless of what the cap is. In terms of what does, you know, the revenue projections look like, you know, we're getting those every quarter. You know, no one's expecting significant growth in lottery revenue. You know, the projections have, while they still show increases, the increases have become smaller in the most recent couple of projections. So we're not expecting a lot of new money there. And so, you know, I think it's worth thinking about the cap in terms of the program itself and what it's designed to achieve. The other thing I would say is that on the front end of the program, we funded a much larger number of FIPs in each cohort than we would expect to in the out years. You know, we funded six, 5, and 5 in the first 3 cohorts of FIPs. And there was never an intent that that would be the number each biennium coming in. That was kind of our startup phase. And we expected from the beginning to get to some level of equilibrium where a smaller number of FIPs are coming on and coming off each biennium. And as to what that right number is, I don't know, maybe 3. But we've not ever had an expectation that we would be funding the same number of FIPs that we did in the first couple of award offerings. So hopefully that helps as additional background and doesn't confuse things more. But I think it's important to think about the cap in that broader context.
Okay, thank you.
So Woody, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, Eric, could you go back to that one slide where you showed the 4 million, the bar graph?
Sure.
If you're looking for a committee recommendation, I need some more information. That one, yeah. So when we were first doing FIPs, which was quite a while ago, we were always in that 2 million range, and now we're getting up into doubling that. So the 35% inflation factor, if that was calculated in, what would that bar look like in the next, you know, period of time? Would it double, or I mean, would it add? Does the 35% include the people where they're at 4 million, or does it look like it would be higher? And if so, what would that figure be? Help me understand that.
Yeah, the 35% it was the cumulative rate of inflation since 2016. So, you know, the top end would be, you know, close to, if the cap were sort of in line with the inflation, the top end would be 5.4.
Okay, so another 1.5 million maybe, if if we followed that trend.
Yeah.
And so that's probably why these cohorts are, going right up to the top, because they're already below what inflation has shown for them. So I can kind of see that, so that trend. So, okay, that answers that question. Thanks.
Let's go ahead with Jillian and then Liz and then Raya. Hopefully I got that in the right order.
Yeah, thanks, Woody. I wanted to mention one thing, and Mark, you pointed this out when just looking at that that chart. Earlier on in the FIP program, maybe the first 3 cohorts, part of the pre-application consultation included some messaging around, yes, 4 million is the cap, and we expect that requests will average around 2 million, 2.5 million per biennium. And as the years went on, that became less realistic. And so we stopped saying that in the pre-application consultations, and you very quickly saw folks then requesting the 4 million more often. So I did want to point that out, that there wasn't just a big jump necessarily. It was some early messaging with the program that I think folks really took to heart and tried to keep up their requests around that to 2.5 million.
Okay, go ahead, Liz.
Hey, thanks, Woody. So I'm this kind of follow up to what Mark had asked, is that 35% inflation. Can I, because I wasn't here at the beginning of the creation of the, the front end loading of the FIPS, on that 35%, that's an average, but on those initial FIPS, did they all require that 35% inflation, or were did some of those keep at the original numbers? And I'm just trying to get a sense of that 35% inflation for the ones that the initial FIPS. Do we know?
Yeah, so thank you, Liz. The 35%, the inflation has not been incorporated into any of the FIP initiatives. So, they kind of came in with their budget as developed, and that was what was kind of stuck with throughout the life of the initiative. And so we're saying now that the funding cap of $4 million has been removed. It'd be good to take into consideration the inflation that has occurred, and that so it can demonstrate that $4 million back in 2016 is worth $5.4 million today, and that is good information to have as a committee and as a board as you consider what that funding cap should be for the next solicitation that will begin here in a couple of months.
And so what Eric, so there was also just the conversation about knowing that what we're also perhaps trading off is understanding that inflation amount. What we're trading off is just the number. And what y'all have said is that there was never an expectation that when we did the larger numbers at the front end, that would continue on. So I'm just trying to get a sense that that's part of our future thinking, understanding what inflation is doing. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Raya, go ahead.
Classic unmute. I was wondering, for the FIP grantees that are receiving this funding, how many of them are using it as match?
I would think all of them are using this funding as match. We require matching contributions to our for our FIP initiatives.
Mm.
I all the FIPs that I'm aware of are then using the FIP funding as match to their leverage sources.
Okay. I was just thinking in terms of, if we're looking for similar outcomes, I think a great question mark right now is what federal funding will be available for these types of initiatives. So is is that FIP funding going to need to be a larger majority of sort of that stacked package and take place some of that federal funding that might not be available? So that was just something I was thinking about. If we're still looking to try and achieve the same outcomes, I think there'll probably just be less federal funding out there for that.
Yeah, good point.
Can I ask a question I should probably already know the answer to? As a non-board member. Do you guys hear a lot from current FIP partners about concerns about the inflation impact? And I mean, I know we hear a lot from grantees that costs are going up, especially related to like labor and steel and, more infrastructure type stuff. How often do you hear, oh my God, $6 million is not what it used to be? Like, what's the sense of how folks are experiencing this on the ground?
So,
Elaine, go ahead.
yeah, so Sarah, I don't feel like I hear that at the biennium level, at the award level for the biennium, but what ends up happening with the FIP program, those that I work with, there's a lot of monetary amendments because projects may have been delayed long enough that their budget estimates were outdated and prices have increased. And so what ends up happening is pulling funding from other places in the work plan, other projects, to be able to fund current projects that have cost overages.
Yeah, so it may be that just fewer projects overall get implemented than would have otherwise, but it's still keeping the partnership afloat enough to, I mean, it may
Yes.
be that folks just don't want to complain about a 3-year, $6 million grant and that the outcomes are reduced as a result of that inflation anyway. That's helpful.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Thank you. Oops, am I frozen?
Yeah, your screen is frozen and I just heard thank you and then that was it.
Okay, maybe I'm back. Thank you for holding for a
You're back.
second. So, I definitely am feeling like, we should up the cap because it hasn't been increased in about 10 or more years. Thinking that like 5 million feels kind of comfortable. I would definitely be open to something higher than that, if we wanted to include the full inflation rate of like, 5.4 or something like that. But I would ask, I know that the board sets the spending plan, and, just from a staff recommendation, does that mean, kind of looking forward, would we have to pull money from other buckets? Are we comfortable and that would kind of be okay for the FIP line item? Would we have to pull from reserves to make that up? Like just kind of looking forward in terms of, what does that increase mean across the rest of, the spending plan? And that maybe also the first time that this would hit would really be, would it be the 2027 budget?
Yes,
That's right.
Yeah, so the spending plan obviously hasn't been developed by the board yet for 27, 29. So this would be kind of that first foray into what that the kind of the rough edges of what that spending plan might look like. So you wouldn't be needing to, borrow from anything because it hasn't been determined yet.
It seems like, and just sorry, real quick, Mark, a quick follow-up on that. the last conversation we had on spending plan with the board, I think was fairly consistent with previous ones, which is, hey, it feels like about 30% of the spending plan, or I forget exactly how that 70, you guys expressed that 70-30 balance for these kind of big landscape scale initiative investments, felt about right. So if that persisted into the 27-29 spending plan conversation, it seems like the trade-off would be then we'll just run a, we may anticipate, Eric's tell me if I'm wrong, we may anticipate a similar conversation with the spending plan and just anticipate funding fewer FIPS at a larger amount per FIP. Is that a fair
Yeah,
assessment?
generally that's right. I think, that what we can't know, of course, is what's going to come in terms of FIP initiative applications. We've not had a cycle where everybody asks for the maximum. And, I think it's unlikely that every applicant will ask for the maximum. And so whatever the number is that's in the spending plan, that's what we would work with, like with all of our offerings, to figure out, working with this committee through that interview process, figuring out what a recommended funding line is.
Eric, how does the application process the graph that we saw earlier, when the cap was 2 million, showed the cumulative inflationary costs, and now we're at 4, which would be at 5.4. So how does the application process screen for fiduciary responsibility among the applicants so that we're getting the most money out there we can, the best bang for our buck, so to speak? Is that an appropriate question for the conversation?
Yeah, some of that is handled through the evaluation criteria, which looks at how the partnership has allocated funding across the different grant types. In other words, is there more of a focus on sort of preliminary work like TA and engagement versus on the groundwork, like restoration projects? And so that kind of cost effectiveness is factored into that analysis. And, which is a little bit different than how our review teams look at individual projects. Where they're, for individual projects, of course, you're looking at line item budgets and are those reasonable costs for the benefit. When you're looking at an initiative application with, a 2-year detailed work plan, the review teams in this committee are looking at, is that reasonable progress in terms of watershed benefit for the funds expended? That is part of the overall equation when we're going through that evaluation process. And I don't want to lose track that Mark had his physical hand up a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Mark, then we'll go to Liz.
Okay, thanks, Woody. I apologize. I must have an old version of Zoom or something. So when we're done today, I'm going to unload, uninstall, and reinstall so I can see if I can find that darn raise hand feature. So back to the question of this committee making a recommendation, and Lindsay had proposed a figure of 5 million. And then I heard Sarah talk a little bit about it, but my question is, does staff have a recommendation of what that figure might look like? Because I know just enough to say, well, that sounds reasonable, what Lindsay proposed, but I don't have the detailed background that staff does. Just Eric, do you or Sarah or staff have a recommendation on what you think would be reasonable given constraints on our budget, given inflationary factors, and given that we really put a lot of emphasis on FIPS and the importance of FIPS to this board and to the, what the intent of OWIB is all about? So long question.
I think for context, it's always helpful to understand that numbers like this are kind of pulled out of the air with some basis in on the ground knowledge and, sort of a gut feel. Is this appropriate? And if we think back to 2015, 2016, our average restoration project at that time in open solicitation was around $150,000. that average restoration project now is more like $250,000. And so, I think at the time we developed the $4 million cap, we were looking at what does, typical restoration cost, and trying to magnify that in a biennium and what's reasonable to expect a partnership to have the capacity to implement in a 2-year period. And so that's how we arrived at the 4 million. So the long-winded answer to your question is, yeah, 5 million feels, in the gut feels pretty comfortable, based on how we set up the $4 million cap in the first place and how restoration costs have trended since that time.
I agree with Eric. I would also just emphasize, I really do think it's a sort of board guidance decision because I honestly, frankly, and as an individual, I do not think lottery will keep up in the next biennium. I'm worried about policy changes there. We're not seeing any significant dip, as Eric described, in the revenue forecast, but I would not assume that we will see a proportional increase in lottery revenue in the next biennium. And so I really do think like what Eric described was this is a reasonable sort of recommendation to accommodate what we know is actually happening on the ground to increased project costs. And I think the board just should be fully aware that may mean funding fewer FIPS in an environment where we see a lot more applications overall because of at least partially because of the dip in federal funding that Raya just described, and that we, shared in our last board meeting, that this may lead to an awkward volume of unfunded applications. But of course, we don't really know whether the pattern we've seen in our open solicitation and other cycles recently will play out in the FIPS or not. But I do think there's a sort of a board level trade-off to be considered there, and that's you guys' job and not ours. That's what you get paid the big bucks for.
Okay, go ahead, Liz, and then Lindsay.
So this is kind of an indirect question, but it's kind of floating around in my mind, is that so if this does go forward and we increase that amount for all those things that we've talked about with inflation, is there like a fairness question, or maybe it's more of a option for those projects and people that are already in the pipeline for the FIPS who might see this and who might be, working on projects that are bumping up that inflationary thing? Just a question out there, and this is something to ponder for what their options might be if we go forward and move to do this. Don't need an answer now, but just a thought.
Okay, go ahead, Lindsay. You're still muted.
Whoops, muted, sorry.
There you go.
Thanks, Liz, for that thought, and something to be mindful of, because we will get questions about that at the full board meeting. And fully recognizing that we do have to make a recommendation, or in January, we will have to make a decision because that funding cap has been removed. And I have to sign off here in a minute. So I just want to say I will support whatever the committee recommends today going forward. But I will just want to chime in and say, I do think 5 million feels comfortable for me for a couple reasons. It's a bump up from 4. So the first bump up that we've had in 10 or more years. It doesn't fully recognize the 35% inflation rate, but it gets close to it. And I know that 35% is sort of a bit of a sticker shock for a lot of us. But really, if someone came into the FIP program and asked for the full amount for the full 3 biennia, they're getting $3 million more. So it's I think that is significant if they did ask for that full amount. I mean, that's a good additional chunk of money to be able to move that needle across the landscape. So that's just sort of where I'm thinking in my justification. But again, happy to support my colleagues in what they feel is the right move.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. I guess my thoughts, I agree with the 5 million that's being thrown out there. But if we're looking at the next 3 biennium, what does anybody have any reasonable expectations for inflation in the next three biennium, while we're looking at possible funding stagnation to decreased funding?
I bet you couldn't even get the chief economist to weigh in on that if he were on the call. Woody, I asked him something similar in an elevator once, and he was not amused.
Before Lindsay leaves, do we need a motion on this, or is it just consensus, or what do you recommend, Sarah, before Lindsay gets away?
Well, Lindsay got away, so it's too
Oh.
late. I don't think we need to have a formal vote. I think we can run with the sense of the committee. And even if you guys couldn't, I mean, I don't hear a lot of dissent among members, but even if you said, here's the recommendation and there's a, dissenting opinion or something like that, I think that would at least give us a starting point for a board conversation. So we're not just playing the numbers game from scratch when we get to January. Which will be a virtual meeting, so we can't even like make hand signals to each other under the table or something like that. So, keep that in mind.
Yes,
Woody, do you know where inflation is going? I saw Mark Labhart.
Well,
Realistically,
it's not likely to. I mean, it might start increasing at less of a rate, but it's still going up. I think is the common consensus. And Lindsay did say she would, on her way out, as she would trust us. Whether that's wise or not, I'm not sure. But yeah, I guess we're probably. Do you think it would be an accurate statement to say we're going to be tasked with, choosing between magnitude and number of FIPS relative to funding?
I mean, it's hard to say because we don't know what the world of the applications are going to look like and what they're going to be requesting. So we could have a cap at a certain number, and then there will be partnerships that will go underneath that. So, it's really hard to say. I mean, I think in general, as the cap would increase, you would think that might lead to perhaps fewer partnerships that are funded. But the devil is really going to be in the details here, and we don't know what's going to be coming in yet.
Just
go ahead, Liz.
I don't have my hand up. I mean, I have my hand up. I don't have my virtual hand up. But I just think, as far as projects coming in, I think OWEB is sort of a victim of its own success. I just looked at the information, those really startling, wonderful photos of Wychus Creek and other projects that just show that ribbon of green, and I've shared that at a number of places. And I just think that, wow, how could we not have more projects? And so I think that's just our dilemma. I mean, it's just, fire on the landscape is more prevalent. The need for restoration is just, everyone is just understanding how important that is. So, it's an interesting problem to have, but OWEB sort of is at the center of that. And we'll just have to work our way through it. But I think communities and the state have really gotten the message how important this is and how these landscape projects, really are making such a difference. So, like you said, Sarah, it's up to us to kind of figure out how to best spend that money in the right places at the right time. So, yeah.
Yeah, I recognize it's a tough position, Liz. And I do think, I'm really encouraged to hear you guys leaning towards an increase personally. And I will say I have not discussed this in any depth with staff, so they're welcome to just disagree with me. But I do think letting applicants know that we're doing our best to realistically reflect the challenges that they're facing on the ground is important. And I don't want to lean in too much on the trade-off too that you just described, because the unique nature of this program, and I remember being in the audience as the OWEB board was, discussing creating FIPS. it is in a sense a strategic contribution that's intended to be large in scale and highly impactful in a particular location. And it's, I do see a dynamic a lot with the board where it's like, boy, we want to make big strategic investments. We have in our strategic plan a desire to be bold in our investments and strategic and an intent to do that. And because we are a responsive funder, we don't go out there and say, boy, this region really needs help. You guys get out there and here's, X million to go solve Y problem. We do it responsibly and responsively, and FIPS are really the way that we do that. So I think, just acknowledging that that's always a trade-off, and that's kind of what FIPS were created for, was to not smear money evenly across the landscape, but to allow people to bring investments to scale, and it just costs more money than it used to cost to bring investments to scale. So that's the kind of gentle counterbalance, I guess, to my previous point to
Right.
what you guys are describing. I think you're kind of dancing around the 5 million number, and I don't think I've heard a counter proposal. So some of that may just be where you're headed, but I think that, that seems to me like a reasonable approach to communicate the tension and move forward with a responsible investment. Unless Liz or Jillian or Eric tell me that I've gotten completely off message here.
It doesn't seem like they're getting ready to do that, Sarah.
I was hoping that people would bring paddles and we could just bring, everybody could raise a number and come. I did see, Woody, that Raya unmuted, so I'm going to take you a step further on the hand raising, non-hand raising. I can just see it.
I'd like to go with 5,200,000. No, I was simply going to say, I think the around the 5 million makes a lot of sense. I'm working on a lot of projects on the ground. And I mean, just a project we started 3 years ago is now 30% higher, let alone, thinking that this is supposed to reflect 10 years. And I think really if we're, focused on outcomes-based grants, as Sarah said, you simply just can't get the same outcomes for the same amount of money. And so trying to make sure that these grantees have the best opportunity to actually be able to achieve that outcome, I think raising the 5 million will allow for that. Whether it'll work over the next 6 years while inflation is doing who knows what.
Predicting the future is not a lot of fun.
Is yet to be seen, but 5 million would be able to at least begin to hopefully get those partners prepared for what those next 6 years would look like.
Yeah, and then rely on the application process to weed out anybody who's just simply asking for more money because they can. I'm very comfortable with that. And Liz is comfortable with that. I'm not hearing that we need a vote on it.
You seem to not be finding any significant dissent here at all.
No.
Would you, if I had to sum up for you? You lost your co-chair to help you wrangle, but
Mark is fine with it.
And Liz is fine with it. Yeah.
Okay, is there any further discussion on this topic? Okay, hearing and seeing none. I guess part of wrap up is checking in to see we still don't have any public comment that's come in while we've been discussing things, or verbal or written. So what would be wrap up and future topics then?
Yeah, thanks, Woody. That's what I was going to bring up, is what to expect for the next meeting, which would be in March, in advance of the April board meeting. We'll, of course, give you a status update of our pre-rulemaking engagement on capacity. By the time of this committee meeting, we will at least have held the webinar with the network and OECD, and perhaps have started our regional listening sessions. So we'll give you an update on that. And kind of related to partnerships is we have right now a solicitation open for partnership technical assistance grants, which received a large number of applications, and we're working through the review process now. So we'll have an update for you on those partnership TA grants that we expect the board to be awarding in April. And reserve the right to add additional agenda items between now and then as they arise. But those two definitely will be on the radar.
Okay, does anybody else have any updates or wrap-ups or anything?
I just want to take a second to acknowledge, I think this committee has had a little slower ramp up than our acquisitions and restoration, and we've had a chance to talk about ecological priorities and to sort of dip our toe in a couple different topics here. This is going to start to get a little higher volume over the next year or so here. This committee will be, as you've seen, really critical to, pre-engagement around the capacity rulemaking process. We'll start talking about process for the FIP solicitation and your role in that. But you had a soft launch and things are starting to pick up now. So just anticipate some more time and effort and probably a faster metabolic rate with this committee going forward. So here we go. Buckle your seatbelts.
Wonderful. I just got notice that the Water Resources Commission is opening 17 rulemakings simultaneously. So, and after I just got a 2,200 page document for various different things. So fun times.
Well, we'll never do that because Eric Hartstein would quit, and we can't have that. So that's not going to happen at OWEB. That's for sure. It will. I think we'll be fine with the existing committee schedule, Woody. I don't mean to overemphasize the busyness level, but I think you guys have gotten a good foundation in the work of these grant programs, and that'll bear up well over the next couple of quarters here. But it's okay. We're not going to swamp you like that.
Well, I do appreciate the heads up. A little bit of warning is wonderful, so that I can complain to people over extreme first world problems.
I'll go arm wrestle with Ivan for your time. I can just cross the patio and go and pick on him anytime. So if you need me to beat him up, let me know.
Perfect. I may request that. Is there any other closing comments relative to our agenda or future topics, questions, anything?
I think we're good, Woody.
All right. Well, we're 15 minutes ahead of schedule, so hopefully we didn't cut anybody short.
Read the first 15 pages of your 2,200 page document if you want.
Well, I'm farther into it than that, thank goodness, since our meeting is coming up here in a week or 10 days. So I appreciate everybody, and I think this was a good meeting. Hope everybody got the chance to ask their questions, and look forward to Nicole telling us what's next.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you guys so much. Have a
Happy
great day.
holidays.